are.
So Amy, welcome to our podcast, Crackers and Grape Juice. I, I know I have heard your name said aloud at Mockingbird, but just say it aloud for us so I don't mess it up.
Amy Mantravadi.
So, okay, that's Italian, I presume.
Actually, it's Indian,
No way,
and
really?
everyone thinks it's Italian because it ends in
Hmm.
an I. But
Where?
my father-in-law was born in, well, it was then Madras, it's now Chennai, India. So he moved here in the 1960s.
Well,
So
there goes my whole
it's,
like first line of banter. I
it's
thought you
okay
were
because
like a
at this
fellow
point,
Paisan.
so many people have mistaken us for Italian, including people we met in Italy who were Italian themselves and Italian speakers, that I've decided to just embrace it because, who wouldn't want to be Italian? It's like they've
That's
got
right.
the best
All
food, the best art, the best, it's like who
bad
wouldn't want
genes. We generally have bad genes.
it? But I had a lot of trouble for a long time centralizing power, but other than that, it's what's not to like. So
So, you know, I'm curious. So I want to talk about your book and the sequel or the second part. But I'm curious to like I don't know much about you, and I want to know how you became kind of a Reformation nerd. Like, what's your story?
well, I mean, to introduce myself, I'm a person of very little consequence, but on the other hand, I'm also the adopted daughter of the God of the universe. So either way, you can figure out
God,
what
that was good.
strategy you should take in dealing with me. So I live in Dayton, Ohio, with my husband and our 5-year-old son. My university education was in political science with a second major in biblical literature, and actually my master's degree, I was going in the international relations direction. So
Okay.
I worked in Washington, D.C. for a little while. That's where I met my husband. He was in the Air Force. Then the Air Force
Okay.
moved us to Dayton,
Dayton.
Ohio, where
Yeah, that makes sense now. Okay.
there isn't a lot of international relations here. So um, that necessitated a change of career. And I got this job where I had to drive all over the place interviewing people at their homes for this research study that was being done. And I thought, this is like wasted hours where I'm just on the road. I got tired of listening to music after a while. So I listened to, a course on first medieval history because I was thinking about writing some novels in the medieval period. And, that was a pretty good course. And then I went on to the next course, which was on the Reformation. And that was where I really got interested. And growing up in a pretty generically evangelical setting, I had heard of Martin Luther. I had some basic ideas of what he was protesting, but I really didn't know him as a theologian beyond just
Mm.
the most basic justification by faith. Um, so that got me a few of the lectures there. One on the Heidelberg Disputation of 1518 really got me interested, and I started reading more Luther. And the first thing I started with was The Bondage of the Will.
Wow.
And yeah, the reason I started
You're a
there
glutton
is
for punishment.
because
Wow.
I know, but I was fascinated by the episode on his feud with Erasmus
Mhm.
because I actually knew who Erasmus was because I mentioned I did that biblical literature degree, and Erasmus was important in the history of Bible translation.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'd had no idea that he had had this feud with Martin Luther. So I just got really into like this clash of personalities. And I read Erasmus's book first on the
Okay.
freedom of the will. Then I proceeded to Luther's. And when I started, my own opinion was a lot closer to Erasmus's. But through the experience of reading that book, I was sort of brought over to Luther's position, both by the arguments he was making, but also some things that God was doing in my life at the time. I'd had an experience where the church I grew up in went through a kind of nasty split. And there were some people saying things to the effect that if someone doesn't repent, then you don't forgive them until they've repented. And that got me just really reading the Bible and what the Bible has to say about how God, demonstrated his love to us while we were yet sinners and things of that nature.
Hmm.
And it allowed me to realize that God moves first when it comes to salvation. And that really got me even more pushing me in that direction. And so the experience of reading those books brought me to a new understanding of theology. I initially was more sort of entered more in the reformed side of things, but now am through various circumstances and brought more to work a lot more with Lutherans and Anglicans. And it's been great because the past 10 years of my life since that happened have been really tough. There have been some very difficult things that have happened. I spent a year having chronic pain where I was getting shipped to like every specialist under the sun to try to figure out what was wrong with me. I had an experience of really terrible clinical depression. And uh, our son, it turns out, has special needs, and that's been like a whole process to go through. And through all of this, my understanding that what it means that God is in control and what it means that he loves us and that he's gracious toward us, graciously disposed toward us, that has been such an important thing for me to have through those experiences. So I think God shows different truths to all of us throughout our life at the time that we need them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And he doesn't reveal
absolutely.
it all at once. So I'm sure I have many truths yet
Mhm.
to accept, but that's where I am now. So and then I had the idea because I had already written the medieval novels to write the two novels about Luther Erasmus, and I threw Philip Melanchthon in there because as I was doing more research, I realized what a great kind of dramatic triangle that created with
Mhm.
Melanchthon being torn between the two of them. And I was really sort of fascinated by how his personality and his life story was each of them had very different personalities and life stories. So I thought that was a good way to approach it
Yeah,
and maybe bring it to an audience who wouldn't pick up The Bondage of the Will and read it.
I mean, yeah, that is a difficult book for people to read. So, I mean, I think what you just said is really important. That I think often, especially preachers, clergy, we think of justification by faith as a doctrine that we are supposed to believe in, and rather, you know, Robert Jensen talks about this. Like, what it is a linguistic rule, to speak the gospel in a way that A, God is the active agent, and B, it sounds like a promise, good news. Um, and yeah, so I think, at the heart of the Reformation is this insistence um, that God is the will behind all things. And I think that's really important to recover. But so I want to make it clear to folks who listen or who are joining us here. So you've written, so it's a historical novel, um,
Mhm.
about these important, Reformation years and debates. Um, and that may seem like a surprising choice initially to people, um, but as with Luther, is the same is true of like John Wesley. Tyr and I are both United Methodists.
Mhm.
That these men, uh, yeah, so these guys, um, they didn't see themselves as setting out to create new traditions and new streams of the church. They're interacting with their times, and the other leaders of the church at the time, and so it's all contextualized by their stories, right? And so like
Mhm.
it makes sense to unravel this theology by way of narrative, because that's the
Mhm.
way it evolved. Um, and so just I want to presume that people don't know anything about the Reformation other than they recognize a name like Martin Luther. So give us like the cast of characters.
Mm. So On the one hand, you have obviously Luther, who is the first person whose protest sort of sparks all of this. But then you have some people on the Catholic side who are reacting against that. So you have Pope Leo, who excommunicates him. Then he has to appear before Emperor Charles, who essentially sentences him to death, and anyone who is also saying the same things that he's saying. And then what is going to happen is that the person who is the governor of Luther's area of Saxony, he basically decides that he's not going to enforce this edict that the emperor has put out. So that means that now the ball goes back into the court of the Roman Catholic Church. What are they going to do? Because in the past, usually, if someone is found to be heretical, and the state will move ahead, and once you're deemed to be heretical, you're seen basically as an enemy of the state because you're a threat to public order. So that it follows a narrative, just like with Jan Hus, who was about 100 years before Luther, held some of the same ideas as Luther, was condemned by the church and then very quickly executed. But
Yeah.
now we've had an interruption because he's just still there, he's still alive. So that necessitates that they find some other way to get at Luther, particularly because the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, is always threatening to invade and turn a lot of Europe Muslim. So they can't really afford to do an invasion of Saxony at that time. So that's when they come to Erasmus, who happens to be, other than Luther, the best selling author of the day. And he's really not like a systematic theologian. He's more of a satirist. He's a commentator. He likes to use biting humor. And he does a lot of translation of ancient documents, including the Bible. So they come to him and say, you need to come up with find some area where you disagree with Luther and write a book opposing him. And then everyone will say, because you're so well respected, they'll listen to what you have to say. And Erasmus says this is a terrible idea
Yeah, I mean,
because
like challenging Luther to a contest of biting humor is like N.T. Wright trying to throw down with David Bentley Hart. It's just a terrible idea. Like the other
well,
Yeah,
guy's way better at it.
look
and
at that.
what happens
Shade and
today?
truth.
Yeah, what happens today when some celebrity comes out and makes some statement? Do everybody all say, like if George Clooney were to come out and, or let's see, a best-selling author, maybe like J.K. Rowling, okay? And she is someone who speaks out on lots of issues. And of course, everybody who read the Harry Potter books automatically agreed with her on every opinion that she put forth, right? We know that always happens. So Erasmus is like, I'm not going to change anybody's mind. This isn't really even my field. And he has his whole career, he has kind of stayed alive and in good pay by not getting on anyone's bad side. And now he's like, everyone's going to hate me because the people who like Luther are going to hate me because I'm attacking him. And the really extreme Catholics are going to hate me because I'm not being tough enough on him. And we see this again happening in our own day and age. But the people who are funding his work, because we know that professors and researchers are always dependent on their patrons or their institutions. They basically turn the screws on him and force him to do it. So, and that creates an interesting situation because Luther has this associate named Philip Melanchthon who is helping him with a lot of his work. And Melanchthon, although he's very much convinced of Luther's theology, he has some personal ties to Erasmus because Melanchthon's great uncle was a good friend of Erasmus before he passed away. And Erasmus is part of this humanist movement, which I always say it's not the same as secular humanists today. It's basically a movement by scholars to recover ancient documents and to kind of get away from the medieval scholastic interminable debates that had always been around during that time. So, and Melanchthon thinks that's a great thing. And so he kind of has these two people he really respects that are now at fisticuffs with each other. And we know, of course, when Luther writes his response, he's not going to pull any punches, because if there's one thing Luther's known for, it's for the abrasiveness of his writing style. So that's sort of the situation. And also at this time, we're starting to see the first fracturing of the nascent Protestant movement, because you have some people who are right there with Luther on everything he's saying, but then you have other people like Zwingli who maybe like some of what he's saying, but then don't agree with him on baptism and the Lord's Supper. And you're starting to get these things happening, and over time this is going to cause the break between the Lutheran movement, the Reformed movement, the Anglican movement, and even within those movements you get other breaks, like eventually, so the Methodists eventually break away from the Anglican movement, more or less, although they're kind of within the Anglican movement. So yeah, because really once you sort of, I guess you could say, from a Catholic perspective, once you open Pandora's box, there ain't no closing it. Once you raise the possibility that the church can be wrong and we need to rethink everything, people are going to be rethinking it in all kinds of different ways. And I think that really caught Luther by surprise, because he
So
thought this was going to be a very limited reform. Obviously, not limited in the importance of it, but limited in the scope. We're not going to get rid of all the art in churches. We're not going to completely throw out the historic liturgy. We're going to reform it, but we're not going to completely throw it away. And pretty soon, just within a few years, you have people saying, oh no, throw everything away. In fact, we
yeah,
shouldn't
yeah.
even be baptizing people. So, which is crazy, but that happens. And, that leads to the situation we see today with the all the different denominations. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
No. Oh, go ahead,
Go
Jason.
ahead. No, you
No, I
go
was just
ahead.
going to say. I mean, it's interesting how um, we always say history repeats itself, and but even within uh, Christianity and within our denomination of United Methodism, where we champion tradition, but nobody really defines
Hmm.
what tradition is. What Even when we go to make these little reforms or changes, they can spiral into um, something new that can be wonderful, or there are the unintended consequences or the unforeseen consequences that come with that. Was that for Luther, for those who have not read, and in the chat, only one person has said they've read the Bondage of Will.
Ken
Um,
Jones, white Ken
um,
Jones.
um, is was that a shock to Luther after a few years
Not just a
of his reforming?
Yeah, not just a shock, but a source of great emotional pain for him, because actually
Mm,
a lot of people who had partnered with him early on ended up
Hmm.
calling him all kinds of nasty things, saying he was
mm.
betraying the gospel. His former colleague at the University of Wittenberg, Andreas Karlstadt, ended up being one of his sort of most deadly enemies, who he ended up then letting stay at his house for a little while, because it turned out that Karlstadt, he got on bad terms with Luther, but he kind of was on bad terms with everyone. The man was sort of, he wasn't a natural diplomat, we'll put it that way. But yeah, I mentioned that I studied political science at school, and I had a professor who said, "You never solve problems in politics; you just sequence them." And I
Hmm.
think it's true for a lot of life. That yeah, it's unpredictable. And part of what I was trying to achieve in this first novel, Broken Bonds, and the sequel coming out in November, Face to Face, is to give people a sense of how chaotic it was to live at this time, because Protestants
Yeah.
tend to think of the period of the Reformation as this sort of golden age
Yeah.
of great theology. All these wonderful things were happening. Everyone was holding hands and singing Kumbaya. And to live through it felt very different. You have the constant threat of war. In Luther's case, the constant threat that you're going to be executed, and just all these broken relationships. And one reason I thought this was a great story to tell at this particular time is because we are seeing that kind of phenomenon in our society. I mean, I think you would both agree with me that we're not all singing kumbaya right now. We're pretty pretty fractured, not just in, in general, but also in the church specifically. Um
Yeah.
coming off of COVID. And then, of course, the politics leaks into the church, and, they both influence each other. But whichever side of that you're standing at, I think we could all agree that there's a lot of unknowns right now about what's going to happen in the world. A lot of things we've kind of taken for granted since maybe the end of World War II are kind of now up for grabs again. And in one way that could be exciting, because I always try to tell people, if I hear them getting down about the news, that just because things are changing doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be change for the worse, because sometimes people intend something one way and then history ends up taking it another way.
Well,
So
yeah, because
yeah.
I mean, um, the similarity. So that Luther lives at a time not unlike ours, where established economic patterns are changing.
Hmm.
Um, um,
Mm.
you know, uh, epics of empire are shifting. This is these are the last gasps of the Holy Roman Empire. Technology. You mentioned the printing press. Technology is changing things. So it's all it's a period of upheaval and chaos and transitions. Um, what's different though, and it comes out in your book, is the mindset of the average Christian, um, you know, in this period.
Mm.
So talk about, one of the characters in your book, who have, I don't know that there are a lot of contemporary Christians in America who walk around with kind of an omnipresent existential dread of God. Um, so just talk about, in some sense, there's similarities between our times, but also the concerns that Christians had then, um, may be different than the ones that we have today.
Yeah, I think probably of all times in Christian history, this period in the early 16th century was about the most aware Christians have ever been of their mortality. I mentioned in that talk at Mockingbird, I mentioned memento mori, remember your death, and nobody ever remembered their death harder than people in the early 16th century. And the reason for this is that back in the 14th century, we have had a complete history changing event in the Black Death, where some areas are seeing up to half of their population dying. And across Europe, we think probably about a third total.
Wow.
And that
They didn't have
brings about it.
ivermectin.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine that today? It would be like in the United States if we lost like 100 to 150 million people. I mean, it's
Mm.
just massive, way, way more than COVID. And as you would expect, even as COVID caused us to think a little differently about theology in some ways, this really made people think differently about theology. And they started becoming very interested in how to die a good death and
Mm.
how to make sure
Oh wow.
that you were prepared for what was coming after death. What we see as a result is a rise in lay piety movements. And throughout the medieval period, and even before that, kind of what people call the Dark Ages, you have monasticism as such a major part of European life. The monks are saying masses for you. The monks are doing these good works that'll sort of somehow, be
Mm.
become useful to you. And that there were these different estates of people, the ones who prayed, the ones who fought, and the ones who were working. And the people who were working, I'm not saying they never went to church, but they couldn't read the Bible on their own. They weren't really, they might say a few Ave Marias at home during the day, but they were not stopping work 5 times a day to say prayers. But now they're starting to think it's not enough for me to rely on the monks to pray for me. It's not enough to rely on, something that somebody else is doing. I need to really shape up. I need to take my Christianity seriously as an individual. And one movement that comes out of this is called the Brethren of the Common Life. They become very big in the Netherlands and end up providing their early education for Erasmus. So,
Mhm.
and the person who maybe some people might have heard of there's a very famous best-selling work at the time, The Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis. And that is the most famous sort of cultural theological artifact to come out of the Brethren of the Common Life. But the other thing you're seeing is that people are thinking a lot more about purgatory. And purgatory really, until the late medieval period, is not fully developed as a theological dogma. And now that we sort of are reaching that point, now what do we need to get us time off purgatory? We need indulgences. So the concept of indulgences really becomes a lot bigger. And people are desperate to go on these pilgrimages or do these good deeds or pay this money to get those indulgences that will prepare them in another way for the afterlife. And this is the context in which Luther is going to start his protest. And the first thing he focuses on is indulgences. Now, that ends up being, it passes pretty quickly as an issue. He's moving on to other things. But it is not coincidental that that is what sparked his reformation and his opinion that when our Lord Jesus Christ said repent, he meant our whole lives should be lives of repentance. It's this idea that we can't just be nominal Christians. We have to really think about where we stand before God. We can't rely on, well, I've been pretty good. I'll probably get to heaven eventually after I've worked in purgatory a while. It's that, thinking, no, it really matters because I'm living my life before the face of God. And alone am going to answer to God someday, not with someone else to support me.
And
So, yeah.
you're making clear why um, the shift with a
Hmm.
recovery of justification by faith is such good news, right?
Yeah.
Because what you're describing, on the one hand, it could look beautiful, trying to live a holy life. On the other hand, it could become an impossible burden.
Yeah. And it did for Luther. And the interesting thing there is, of course, we are living in the least death conscious era of human
Hmm.
history. Uh,
Hmm.
I've heard a Reformation scholar say once that if you were living in Luther's day, from a young age, you would have seen dead people because they were dying. Someone might have died in your house, and that's just they didn't get taken away to old age homes or to the. I mean, they did have
Yeah.
a few hospitals, but
No
and
hospice.
they couldn't just be sedated or medicated at death. They would die pretty tortured a lot of the times. So it was just at the forefront of their minds, so much more than it is for us, where we kind of have shut it away to a certain extent. And of course, we now have movements in multiple countries to, you know, die with dignity, which means we get to select, freely choose when we're going to die, and do it, without having to go through any pain. And that opens a whole nother can of worms. But it just shows it's one of many ways. Probably the most obvious is the current transhumanism movement, which is thinking that we can just not die at all. But we are really trying to put death out of the public eye so we don't have to think about it. We don't have to deal with it. I would say it's a case of us protesting too much. The fact that we're so obsessed with not thinking about it and acknowledging it probably suggests that somewhere in the back of our minds, we really are very worried about it. But,
Yeah.
It's all we think
you know,
about, and it's because it's all we think about. We try to block. We try to ignore it. I mean, just all the
hmm
things that we um, just watching TV in the evenings, like or whatever ads you have on social media. At least in my age demographic, all I'm getting right now is like even for men, like anti-aging, how to live longer, to have a more longevity uh, in my life. Other commercials too, but that's something
Well,
else.
and how do you think I feel? I mean, probably within
Well,
10
yeah,
years, people will be asking me if I want to inject, botulinum toxins in
yeah,
my
uh-huh.
skin to make me not look old. And which, I mean, think about that. Think about what we're doing to
I
ourselves,
know,
Uh-huh.
because we're so afraid of death
but
and we're not
but
willing to admit it.
pasteurized milk is a danger. Yeah, I know. It's so so this is a historical novel, and Luther and Melanchthon and Erasmus are prominent characters. But so anyone who knows Luther kind of reasonably well knows what a partner his wife Katie was to him.
Mm.
And so there's a way that you can't tell the story apart from the women who were participants in this movement. And so you've highlighted some female characters in this story. So talk about the women.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have in the first book, we don't see a ton of Katerina von Bora because they're not married yet, and she wasn't a huge part of his life, but we do see her popping up occasionally. And we see more of Melanchthon's wife. Now, trying to figure out what their relationship was like was a little more difficult because we don't have nearly as much surviving. So I had to kind of, to a certain extent, just create her from my imagination because there's not a lot to tell us what her personality was like. But I also used their story a little bit, and there's a long flashback at the end of that book about how they met. I used it a little bit to illustrate this principle that actually faith is less like making an intellectual decision between different rational choices, and it's more like falling in love, and it's more about our desires being changed. So I kind of maybe took a few liberties to sort of use that portion of the story to illustrate that point, because at every turn I'm trying to just weave these principles in subtly, because if people wanted a work of academic theology, they could go on and get one. That's not what
Mhm.
I'm trying to do here. We're trying to do it by kind of shaping people's imaginations, giving it to them in a bit softer kind of way, a bit more accessible for people who wouldn't read academic kind of stuff. Not that they're dumb, but it's just, it's not always the most interesting. So,
So that
yeah.
that's uh, here, and I have a friend named Tony, and he is working on a historical fiction book about Saint Simon the Stylite, who
Mm.
like built a pillar and just lived on top of it.
Yeah.
To get
Yeah.
and so Tony was explaining to me that he can't write just pure fiction, that he called them tent poles. He needed these like points that would make up the skeleton of the story. And so I'm wondering, like, what is your writing process? Like, do you feel beholden to the historical data, or are you kind of just, is it like, this is the stuff and you can create a story from it? Like, how do you think about this process?
Yeah, my general rule is that I'm not going to violate anything that's in the historical record, but I will have to add things to it to sort of flesh out the story. For instance, we might know that someone had surely had a housekeeper in their house, but we don't know what their name is. So now we're going to create that person. In this case, actually, because these three men are so well studied, we often do know like the name of the person working in their house. But that doesn't get us any closer to knowing, what was their personality like? What was this relationship like? So I sat down with two goals. The first, to just give the historical details and present what happened historically. And if you go through my book, you'll see like the actual dates things are happening. And you can a lot of times cross check that with their
Hmm.
letters or other things, legal documents that tell you, yes, this happened on this day. But I also equally thought about the theological points I wanted to make. So I kind of had two separate, like I call them sandboxes, where I just throw all my different notes and different thoughts in there.
Okay.
And I had one section for, just actual historical story points, and another for, I want to make sure I mention, I had a list of different scriptures that I wanted to see if I could find some way to incorporate them at different points. And so, I mean, people can decide for themselves how good a job I did of weaving that all together. But it is, I think, a lot of my favorite novels that I've read in my life, they have something to say, if not explicitly theologically, then philosophically. There's something in there that they're trying, some point, bigger point that they're trying to make. And I think that is when, literature kind of gets taken to the next level and becomes a lot more eternal, I guess you could say, in terms of humans reading it. But I'm not saying that I've reached that level, but it is more, it's a bit more of an ambitious thing to do, but also I think a more sort of, not important is not quite the right word, but it feels almost like it's more worthwhile in that respect, that you're also trying to communicate some kind of message and it's not just purely entertainment or fluff, though there's a place for that for sure. But yeah, I really want to read this novel about the stylite. That sounds good. I
I
mean,
will.
I do wonder what kind of mindset would cause someone to want to stand up there for all that time. And it would be interesting to sort of dig into that. So, yeah, let me know when that one's out.
Yeah, he was like, yeah, he's like, my premise is, further away from people, no closer to God. And I was like, that sounds
Mm.
a lot like you, Tony. I don't like, maybe that's too much projection.
So
But actually,
his name is Tony, and he's not doing the book about Saint Anthony, the Desert
mm-mm.
Father, because that seems like an obvious. It's right there.
um, so I mean that invites the question though, like, where are you in this novel?
Where am I in the process?
No, like, where are you? Like,
Character, who, where,
yeah, yeah.
Oh, who am I in the
where do
novel?
you,
Mhm.
where do we find you?
Well, I like to think that I have a very multifaceted psyche, Jason. And I like to think that each of these characters sort of reveals certain things about me, but of course, none of them really are me. And to be fair, none of them are exactly the historical persons either. Like, I don't think it's possible to fully capture who Martin Luther was at a character in a book. So I tell people these are three characters who bear a striking resemblance to three historic persons. I'm not claiming that this is exactly what they were like. And I think it is difficult when you have some people who are so well known. People have spent their entire lives writing about either Luther or Erasmus. Fewer about Melanchthon. But it's kind of like when you read a book and then you watch the film adaptation and you're like, oh no, that's not right. It should have been, it clearly was supposed to be this way in my mind. And I realized that, especially with Luther, some people will read this and be like, I thought, that's not quite how I thought of Luther. So you have to accept that it is a little bit of a creation. But in terms of, I probably have the most in common with Melanchthon in this story, not because I'm intelligent as he is. Oh goodness, no. But because I also in my life have often felt myself kind of torn between different
Hmm.
forces, and maybe not always specific people, although that has happened sometimes, but different, maybe different movements, because there's part of me that always is drawn to the more realist, cynical way of seeing things. And there is part of me that's more hopeful and optimistic. And I do feel myself often getting torn between that. And in a certain way, that in a very crude way, that is sort of the divide we're seeing, because Luther has a very negative opinion of human nature, and Erasmus a very positive one. I think circumstances cause Erasmus to have to rethink that position a little bit, because he
Hmm.
can no
Hmm.
longer deny that we're not altogether wonderful. But that it's kind of it's really the old divide. They're debating free will, but that touches on so much of what it is to be human. And I think it's an eternally relevant philosophical debate for that reason, both in the church and in the secular world. This is a topic of debate. I remember a few years ago I read this book by Sam Harris, who's one of the new
Hmm.
atheists, and he wrote this little book about free will, and he's arguing we don't have it, but for
Hmm.
different reasons than Luther, because he's a complete, absolute materialist. So he thinks everything we're doing is determined by some material thing that's
Yeah.
happening. So we don't really have free will. And I think, wow, that's interesting. He has a completely different set of reasons, but he comes to the same place. In fact, he's even more severe than Luther because Luther thinks you can choose what you want to have for breakfast, but Sam Harris doesn't think that. So, that's very interesting and raises the question of whether anyone is ever responsible for anything if we have no choice in the
Oh
matter.
man.
So,
So,
yeah.
so one of the things you do well in this book, um, because I can imagine what a terrible version of this book would be pretty easily. Um, you know,
You can
y-
imagine because you've read
no,
it.
I think it could be very easy. It, you know, it could be very easy just to have characters spouting ideas, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so we you were just talking about the freedom of the will. The other side of that is predestination, um, justification by faith. Um, so talk about how you thought about as a writer, um, fictionalizing and putting into narrative form, story form, complicated ideas.
I think I was taking on a very big challenge in writing these books. First of all, I had to make theologians interesting, which, let's face it,
I mean,
it can be
no,
a
no,
difficult
no one can
task.
say that Luther is not an interesting character.
This
Like,
is true. This
I
is
mean,
true.
warts and all.
But there, I mean, the main crux of the plot is over this theological issue. What I really tried to show is that it's something we all deal with in our lives every day. It's actually incredibly practical. Whether or not you think God is in control of your salvation, whether he's in control of world events, is going to absolutely affect how you're viewing, what's happening in the news. Or, you know, recently, my husband got let go from his job. Don't worry, we still are eating. We still have our house. We're doing okay. But he was feeling very discouraged about this. Oh, will I ever be able to find a job in this economy? And I said to him, it's okay because God is in control and he's going to bring you to wherever you need to be. He puts everybody where he wants them at the precise time that they need to be there for his work and his glory. If I didn't believe that, I'd be
Hmm.
feeling a little differently right now. And I've just seen how it affects how you think about absolutely everything. So I said, how can I show that? And also, how can I show the impact of what it's like to live under the law, to think that you're going to be justified by keeping the law? And that's what we see with Erasmus a lot in these books. He's trying desperately to act righteously, but for various reasons knows himself to be not entirely righteous. So you see what a burden that is. And, you know, I'm not trying to, just speak negatively about people who hold different theological opinions, but I think that it's a fact that you're going to feel differently about how you are validated as a human being if you
Hmm.
don't believe that you're being justified by grace through faith and the account of Christ's work. That will make you think differently about your life. And we have a whole lot of religions and philosophies in the world that are trying to help people be justified by law keeping. They don't always call it law keeping, but that's what it is. And we have a whole lot of people
Wellness.
looking
It's
to
called
other
wellness now.
humans. Yes. Looking to other human beings to tell them that they're worthwhile. And it changes your whole life if you really believe that you're already, as I said,
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
adopted daughter of the God of the universe. If that's what I really am, then actually it doesn't matter that much if I completely mess up this interview. Now, I'm sure you wouldn't appreciate it if I completely messed up this interview, but it's not going to affect my eternal destiny, and it doesn't change my inherent worth. And, I just got done reading Dave Zal's latest book, The Big Relief. I don't know if either of you have read it yet, but of course
Yes, yes.
Yes.
you were at the
Obviously, you
top.
didn't listen to the interview we did with him.
I
Yikes. Yikes.
I didn't because here's the thing, every podcast I listen to has been interviewing him, and I realizing I have had so much of David Zal in my life the past few weeks.
It's
Not
been a
only
lot.
at the conference, but
We're gonna have to cut
I
this part
also
out.
read the book to review it, and it's like I need to I need to be careful about how I parcel out my Zal in my daily life.
I
But
mean, if Dave finds out that Amy has too much Dave Zoll in her life,
uh,
that's gonna send him down a
So
dark hole.
at Mockingbird, my wife was there. It was her first time ever being
mhm.
anywhere near this group of people. She goes, "Dave Zoll, he seems pretty important around here. People seem to know him and like him." It's like, well, that's kind of an understatement for this group back in New York in April.
They like him um, because of the kind of stuff he wrote in his book,
Yeah. Mhm.
because he's pointing them to Christ and he's viewing them through the lens of grace. And not just Dave Zalba, I think you'll see in that whole Mockingbird organization and among lots of other people who kind of have the same view of theology. Hopefully, they will be reading you based on
Mhm.
how what
Yeah.
their theology is telling them to believe. Now, I have met people who, though they will say with their lips that they believe that, they somehow it's not connecting in their daily life. And law keeping is a hard habit to break. But I think you'll see that filters down through the culture of that organization. And also, I write for 1517, and I think it's a lot there in that organization as
Mhm.
well. And that's something you want to see because I've been around Christian writing long enough that I've seen when things do go that way and when they don't. And
Yep.
when they don't, oh boy. So,
Well, yeah,
yeah.
I mean, um, so Tyr, you mentioned tradition earlier, and Amy, you mentioned how um, in the period leading up to Luther, purgatory became a more central concern than it had been before. And then with the printing of with the advent of the printing press, um, suddenly Christianity does become a religion of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we forget that it wasn't before then. And so it isn't so much that Christianity has a tradition; it's that Christianity is a faith that is always traditioning, um, right? Which means that like we exist in this narrative, and things are constantly shifting. And so if you're not paying attention to what's around you, which is what Mockingbird is trying to do, you it's easy to hold on to something called the tradition, but because you're not you don't notice that you're moving with the stream of the times. You're not interacting with the culture and things like that, and
Mhm.
so you lose the ability to articulate the message.
Hmm.
Um, and so that was just me speaking. There was a question in there, but it slipped away. Yeah. Um,
Well, yeah, go ahead.
no, no, no. This is your time, Amy. Yeah.
Well, if it is my time, then I'm going to drop an interesting tidbit, which is that my grandmother, who is going to turn 93 this June, is actually an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church.
Wow.
See.
But she wasn't able to convert you.
Well, interesting, you see. So my mother grew up in the UMC and she married someone who was Baptist. And that
That
kind of, as
happens.
often happens, the husband sort of dictates the way things go. But yeah, it is interesting because she's actually was always a minister of music, and she started as a deacon and then she got ordained as a reverend. So, but have memories of like going to my grandma's church growing up, and I always liked it because they had a children's portion of the sermon where we got to go sit up front, and I thought that was pretty cool. But I had very little understanding of what exactly was Methodism or what was the significance of the fact that their church was
Mhm.
different than ours. And it is interesting, kind of now learning a lot about church history and seeing how that developed. And I think there would be perhaps another good novel looking
I was
at
just gonna say, if you want to write about an OCD guy who
yeah.
was a bad husband, John Wesley's right there for you. Um,
Yeah, yeah. But I think very interesting. So John Wesley and George Whitfield famously, were friends even though they didn't agree.
Hmm.
And why did their relationship end up going different than Luther's with Erasmus? Would be a very interesting question to ask, because they were able to find some sort of agreement. And I think Luther would say because Erasmus is just like in a completely different religion than he is.
So, so
But
you know,
yeah.
as you write this, are you? I'm just curious about the process. Do you do all the research and then you have it in your head and you write the story, or like are you writing, bits and pieces of the
Mm.
story and then like going to like do some research and then coming back to it? Um,
Mhm.
I just the labor of it interests me.
Well, I had hoped to possibly write these books for, several years before I ended up sitting down and writing them. So during that time, I was occasionally, you know, reading up on things, and anytime someone would be talking about this incident, my ears would perk up. But then when it finally came time to do it, I had a period of a few months that were just very dedicated research time, just gathering data and plotting out what all the scenes were going to be, and what order they were going to be in, and what I wanted the word count to be. And I ended up having way too many words as usual, which is why it's two books instead of one. But and then at a certain point, you just have to start writing, because you could research forever. And the problem is that a lot of that research doesn't end up getting used, because the point of a novel is not to show off how much you know about history. It's not to throw on as much as you possibly can. You need to include that which serves the
That goes for
story.
sermons too, dear, which
Yes,
is
yes.
That's I
yeah,
had that a
chief
couple
among
weeks ago.
sinners. Yeah.
Yeah. So then as I go on, I start writing, and then before I write any scene, and I did go just in scene order, I then do more research about related to that particular scene, to make sure I understand, if it's taking place in this location, that I understand, the logistics of that location.
Mm.
So, and even into the final editing, there has been some research, because someone will say, this doesn't match this. Are you sure about
They
this?
didn't
And I'll
have
have to
that
go
kind of
back and,
China then.
yeah, it is always my fear that, I'll be honest, like this book and the second one, both I've sent to Dr. Robert Kolb to see if he wants to endorse it. And the first time he was just so insanely busy that he couldn't. And I think that might also be true the second time. Part of me's glad that he hasn't read it, because I'm like, he'll know when I get things wrong. And
Yeah,
I
that's gotta
just
be.
am very intimidated by the idea of, someone who's that much of an expert reading it. In truth, like I saw with my previous novels, which were set in the medieval period, like I had this fear that medievalists would read it and point out my flaws. But the thing is, they don't read it, or if they do, they don't they don't point out your flaws. So I'm not nearly famous enough for that. But yeah,
Yet.
I
Yet.
well, after we've recorded this, I'm
That
sure
was the point.
my
Yeah.
stock will be rising. But I did occasionally, if something just pops in my brain as some good lines of dialogue, I have a little file open, and I record it
Okay.
for later. But for the most part, it was a really I ran a very tight ship with these books. I did stick to the list of scenes I had intended. I didn't add any extra scenes. And yeah, it pretty much, it was a better oiled machine, because
Mm.
at this point, I'm not just a complete beginner. When I was a complete beginner, I just sat down and said, okay, this would be a nice scene, I'll write this. Oh, that would be a nice scene, I'll add that. And I ended up with like way too many
So,
scenes. So yeah.
face to face, is that the title of the second
Yes,
book?
I have it. Actually, I have a little copy right
Oh
here,
wow.
and I've got my I'm seeing typos as I read back through it. It's tab, but there you go.
And
That's what it's gonna look
and
Oh
like.
my gosh.
and like all things 1517, the covers are really nice.
Zach, who does the covers, he does a really good job. He made it for the first one. I had said, could we give it a little sense that it's like those woodcuts of the Reformation
Mm-hmm.
era? Because
Mm-hmm.
when you think of the Reformation, those just are like so strong in my mind when
Yeah.
I think of it. And he was able to do that a little bit, and then he was able to make the second book look like it goes with the first book without looking exactly the same as the first book. And it also looks like it belongs with other 15, 17 books, while also being a little bit unique. So I thought he did a really good job.
So can you give us a little snapshot preview of the sequel?
Well, where we last left our heroes, Luther did have this little emerging issue with this runaway nun who was annoying the heck out of him. And he, of course, is always worried that he's going to die because there's a sentence of death pronounced against him. And so that was very much in his thoughts at the end of the book. Erasmus had just had a sort of, it felt to him like a near death experience with some kidney stones. And he did historically have kidney stones a lot. So he's just questioning, like, he had this kind of brush with death and what would have happened if I had died then. And it's making him think a lot about,
Mhm.
yeah, how to die a good death. And the Melanchthons just their second child was born with some serious health issues potentially, so they've got that hanging over them. And Melanchthon, of course, is still wondering: will Luther ever respond to Erasmus? If he does, is he going to be any degree cordial toward Erasmus?
Hmm.
So, and what we're going to see happen, because this second book covers the mainly the year 1525. This is the year of the German Peasants' War, which is a major popular uprising by the lower class. And it really isn't one united movement. It starts out kind of really as just looking for more rights for the peasants and some relief from taxation and things like that. By the time we get to spring of 1525, it's turned into this weird apocalyptic death cult. I mean, it's
Mm.
like farmers just taking their pitchforks and nothing else and going into battle against, fully armed knights who
It
have
definitely
like
changes your
cannons and things.
perception of Mennonites.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I like when you learn about the history of the Anabaptists and of the Swiss. Both of those we think of now as very like peaceful,
Yeah.
nonviolent, but at this time,
Yeah.
the Anabaptists were the most radical, the most willing to engage in political violence, and the Swiss, they were the most feared fighters in Europe, which is why
Mhm.
they didn't really fight their own wars, but they would get hired to fight in everybody else's because they were so good. So, which is why you still have the Swiss guards in the Vatican, who we
Yep.
saw these past couple weeks.
Um,
So,
Jeffrey
yeah.
Jeffrey Jeffrey Pugh has been on the podcast a few times, and after he retired um, as a theology professor, he wrote a historical fiction book called Cages,
Mhm.
about the peasants'
Yes.
revolt. Yeah, about the peasants'
It's pretty
war.
good.
Yeah. It is the largest popular uprising in Europe prior to the French Revolution. Some people think between like 50 and 100,000 people are killed because once the princes and the knights can get it together and tolerate each other's presence enough to oppose this movement, it just becomes a complete bloodbath. They just start killing everyone, and so that happens, and it involves Luther because a lot of people blame his ideas for starting this. So that's a very big thing that happens. And then we do have Martin Luther's marriage that happens this year, which is an important part of the plot. And I didn't choose to cover this period precisely because I wanted to write a romance novel. But you see, it is actually important because it affects his theological thinking. Some of the emphasis that you're going to see later on how Luther views creation, how he views our physical bodies, how he views creation as something we should enjoy and not, we shouldn't be just pursuing this ascetic lifestyle where we're
Hmm.
being harsh to our bodies as he had when he was a monk. Some of that thinking, I think, is tied to this period and what he sees in the radical theologians of that time, and then his decision to enter into marriage. So you have that, and then we're going to end up with the release of Luther's response to Erasmus and see how that affects the relationship between the three of them. So yeah, it will be interesting. And Erasmus has a professor at what's now the Sorbonne, was then the University of Paris, starts writing these letters accusing him of heresy, and he's all worried about that. And Melanchthon is worried that Luther has gone completely off the deep end. So there's a lot of drama. And I do always try to get all the bodily fluids in there. So we've got blood, sweat, tears, crap. We've got it all. Urine, yes, also urine. Oh, vomit. We've got it all in there. So something to look forward to for readers.
And then what is the next project?
Well, I'm focusing a lot on essay writing and also book reviews right now,
Okay.
but we'll see if the Lord leads me to write another novel. I have, in the words of George Costanza, I have plans, schemes, uh, nefarious intents,
Yeah.
but we'll see. We'll see if that happens, if the door is
Okay.
opened. I think it would be fun to write another one, but I also always want to be improving as a writer. And because I think that, it's sort of not to be the best writer, which I know I can't be anyway, but there is something be said for if you're going to do a job, doing it well, pursuing your vocation that God is giving you with excellence. So
Yeah.
I hope that I can continue to develop and precisely that God will point me to the kind of writing He wants me to be doing at the present time that'll be most beneficial for the church.
Well, Amy, you haven't been on the
Amy,
podcast
thank you.
before, and so we're gonna, you know, uh, do what we did for a long time, but have stopped doing because we had so many repeat customers. We're gonna ask you the 10 questions from inside the actor studio.
Oh,
So,
okay.
so Tier, take it away.
What's your favorite word?
Hmm. My favorite word? Oh gosh. Maybe like, well, no. Oh, I know. Resurrection.
What's your least favorite word?
Hell, probably. Doesn't sound very nice.
What turns you on?
It makes
Now,
it really
in what
uncomfortable to ask that
sense do
question.
we
I
mean
hate.
this?
Okay, just so because we have 63 people watching, this is my least favorite question to ask women. Like intellectually, everybody.
Intellectually.
Yes,
Okay. Um,
let people can
I
see how uncomfortable I am
really,
right now.
right now, I like when people who have ideas about um, how we can use the imagination and different kinds of arts and artistic projects to help people think about spiritual things.
Mhm.
But also, I am a big stan of the beatific vision. So, this is something I never heard about growing up, but I happened across some people who were like always talking about this, and now I've caught the bug. So, I just always get
Okay.
excited about the beatific vision.
What turns you off?
Arrogance,
Hmm.
always.
What's your favorite curse word?
Oh, well, I don't normally use curse words in real life because I grew up in an environment where that was like, something you just didn't do. But I did particularly enjoy that in these books, they allowed me to use the word shit quite a bit.
Oh,
Coming out of Luther's stuff. Look, I'm, again, I don't usually use this in daily life, but I have to admit, there is something very satisfying about when you come across something that really is genuinely awful or an awful turn of
yeah.
events. That word is it brings you relief. It brings you big
Mhm.
relief.
Yeah. I mean, and Luther was not afraid to throw down. So,
Don't tell my parents that I said that, but
What's your favorite sound?
Hmm. When my son laughs, that's my favorite sound.
how old is
What's
he?
your least? Oh, sorry.
He's 5. Least favorite sound. Okay, so I have several sounds that are triggering for me in a negative way. And I'm kind of afraid to say them because then I'm afraid people will start making them to torture me. I do not like it when people are noisy about eating, particularly slurping. I do not like, and that's another word I don't like. I do not
Yeah.
like the word slurp. I do not like the sound of it. It just, and I'm with people and I'm like, I know this is a weird thing for me, so I should not make a big deal about it. But I'm like, just cringing when I hear it.
If you could do any profession other than what you're doing now, what would it be?
Hmm. Well, I probably, well, let's see. I was going to be in international relations. So I'd probably still be doing that.
Mhm.
Maybe the world would be better if you were doing that.
The world would be better if I was doing that. But I did discover in 4 years of working on the Middle East that I don't know if I could do an entire lifetime of that.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
What profession would you never want to do?
I don't think I'd ever want to be any kind of salesman. Now, I'm forced to do some marketing for my book, but anything that involves really having to kind of aggressively get in people's faces, that
Yeah.
just would be very difficult for me.
And last one. Since heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Mm. Well, I guess I'd want to hear him say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Mostly, I just wanted to say, that he accepts what Christ has done on my behalf.
Hmm.
That you're justified.
Yeah.
And I think he already does say that to me in his word. But of course, it's nice to actually, I'm sure it'll be extra
Actually hear
nice
it.
to hear it.
Yeah.
Good. Well, Amy, thanks so much for joining us.
Now, what God is actually going to tell me is, Amy, the Methodists were right. But,
Mhm.
you know, well, we will await that glorious day.
The
Hopefully,
Methodists
yeah.
are
I mean,
over there. The Methodists are
he
over
won't
there.
say like, "Oh, like someone's made a terrible mistake."
No, I think there will be room in heaven for a few Methodists. For a few.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Thanks for
Thank you, Amy.
writing this and sharing it
Thanks, guys.
and
This has been
giving us your
very
time.
fun.
So, Tier, the pleasure was all yours.
Always is.